Gaining your capital but losing your country is what happened to the Lithuanians 1939-1940. Vilnius, or in Polish Wilno, was part of the Second Polish Republic. Poland was carved up by the Nazis and the Soviets. The Soviets took the city and granted it to the Lithuanians. However, in the Hitler-Stalin Pact was also included that the Baltic states were for Stalin to take. And officially, Lithuania was annexed in the USSR in 1940. What happened to many Lithuanians was death or deportation. How were the Soviets able to take Lithuania almost without a fight is what you will learn today. Welcome back to the channel. If you are new to this channel, my name is Evan. I'm a Dutch history teacher and I love to talk about history, discover these niche topics. In this video, we're going to talk about Lithuania under Soviet occupation. If you find this content interesting, subscribe, hit that notification bell, leave a comment, leave a like. And if you want to support me financially, you can do so via PayPal, Patreon, via Super Thanks, or you can buy me a coffee. Till World War I, Lithuania was part of the Russian Empire. At the end of the 18th century, it had become part of it. Lithuania consisted of Vilnius, Kaunas, and the Suwalki provinces, as well as the city of Grodno, Gardinas, now located in Belarus. This area belonged to the Pale of Settlement, an area where Jews were allowed to live. Therefore, Lithuania had a large number of Jews living in its borders. During the First World War, Lithuania was captured by the Germans. But after the Russian Revolution and the ensuing Russian Civil War, and the Germans had to evacuate Eastern Europe, much more turmoil arose. And the Lithuanians were fighting in different wars of independence. They were fighting against the Bolsheviks. They were fighting against the Bermontians, the whites, led by Pavel Bermont Avalov, commander of the West Russian Volunteer Army. And they fought against Poland. And they lost the control for the city they cherished so much, Vilnius, because Vilnius ended up in the Second Polish Republic under the name of Wilno, and thus the Lithuanians had to do with Kaunas as their capital. Though the population of Vilnius was mostly Polish and Jewish, Lithuanian nationalists cherished it as essential to a resurrected Lithuania, but Poles harbored similar aspirations. The Lithuanians engaged in a triangular struggle against both Bolsheviks and Poles over the city, and in 1920 the Poles resolved the matter by seizing Vilnius, which precluded normal relations with Poland. Interwar Lithuania started as a parliamentary democracy, but that changed. In 1926, Antanas Smetona established a military dictatorship. Not only anti-Russian or anti-Soviet sentiments arrived in Lithuania, also anti-German sentiments. And that had to do with the city of Klaipėda in German, Memel, which was mostly inhabited by Germans, surrounded with an ethnic Lithuanian countryside. Back in 1923, the Lithuanians had occupied the disputed city. Because of this, the Lithuanians were left out of a joint defensive alliance formed by Estonia and Latvia in the same year. In 1934, though, Lithuania was admitted under the condition that Klaipėda and Vilno were non-issues. Despite this so-called Baltic Entente, there were no preparations for military coordination. Looking at Lithuania's military, it maintained a national army of around 30,000 men in 1938. Relying upon the League of Nations system and the Western powers as guarantors for their freedom, preserving their independent status became a bigger challenge when the Soviets and the Germans signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression pact, in 1939. The Lithuanians could now only speculate what was to come, but what was to come had already been decided. Annexation by the USSR. In a secret protocol, the Nazis and Soviets agreed that Lithuania was for the Soviets to take. Hitler had already seized Klaipėda, Memeland, in March 1939. World War II started in September when Germany invaded Poland. But the Germans did not invade Poland alone. Yes, the Slovaks did as well, but the Soviets did so too. And they invaded the east of the country. Nearly 500,000 combat troops, assisted by 4,850 tanks, 5,500 armored vehicles and 2,000 aircraft. They were to capture Vilno, Grodno and Lviv within 48 hours. Okulich-Kozarin had 7,000 soldiers at his disposal, ranging from volunteers to trained cadres with a dozen of artillery pieces and machine guns. The Poles, they resisted the Soviet incursion valiantly, but due to their sheer numbers, the Red Army prevailed. The Red Army officially registered 24 of their men killed in action, but most likely the number is higher. On the 10th of October, Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs Vyacheslav Molotov made Lithuania to sign a treaty with the USSR to allow Soviet troops on its soil. At first, the Soviets were demanding the entry of 50,000 soldiers, but they reduced the number to only 20,000. In return, the Reds handed over Vilnius to the Lithuanians. Their long-cherished capital was now theirs. This somewhat sweetened the deal. Negotiations between the Lithuanians and the Soviets were made more difficult as their fellow Baltic nations, Estonia and Latvia, were forced to sign similar deals. Lithuania lost its neutral political status and a degree of its sovereignty. Only the recovery of Vilnius, Lithuania's historical capital, was a ray of sunshine in an otherwise bleak situation. Furthermore, Lithuania had become dependent on the USSR, leading many members of the public to keep. Now Vilnius belongs to us, but we belong to the Russians. Full Soviet occupation occurred in June 1940 under the pretext that the Lithuanians had captured 2 Red Army troops. Molotov demanded that Lithuania would let in more Soviet army units in unlimited numbers. And did you know that the USSR was actually preparing for a battle to take Lithuania? Near the borders, they established field hospitals to help those who would be injured, and also barracks to house the foreseen prisoners of war. And already in the spring, the Soviets had secretly stationed Soviet spies who were able to speak Lithuanian and who had to come into action to seize power locally once the Soviets would invade the country. And clashes did occur actually, because on the 15th of June 1940, the Red Army attacked several border stations on the Lithuanian border. One policeman was killed, another one was captured, and others were disarmed. The Lithuanian government then discussed what to do, and ultimately it was decided that they would put up no armed resistance, because this would only lead to further casualties in a battle they were sure they couldn't win. And thus the government accepted the Soviet ultimatum. On the 15th of June 1940 at around 3 p.m, crudely violating all bilateral agreements that it had with Lithuania, the USSR ordered an indefinitely large military contingent, the 3rd and 11th Armies, unlimited by any treaties, to enter Lithuania and occupy the most important strategic points in Lithuania. Meanwhile, military aircraft packed with troops were landing in Lithuania's airports. The real power went to Vladimir Dekhanosov, the emissary of the Soviet government who arrived from Moscow on the afternoon of the 15th of June. He was assisted by a small Communist Party of Lithuania, the CPL, and of course thousands of Red Army troops. When all hopes of a Soviet-free Lithuania were dashed, many Lithuanians hoped that their country would not be annexed into the USSR, but this was not to be. When President Antanas Smetona left the country, this was explained as a president's resignation. A transitional puppet people's government was installed on the 17th of June. Justas Paleckis became the prime minister. The Soviets announced they would not make any further essential changes, and the key government positions went to communists. The CPL became the only legal party in the country, and all non-communist parties were abolished. The Lithuanian military was disbanded and many senior officers were arrested or murdered. A People's Army was created, and that unit was later absorbed into the Soviet 29th Rifle Corps. Many Latvians fled abroad to Germany, where they founded the Lithuanian Activist Front, or the LAF, which was led by Colonel Kazys Škirpa. Others went into hiding, waiting to strike. Mid-July, elections were held. Public threats were made that persons who abstain from voting are enemies of the people. According to official data, the 14th to 15th July elections to the People's Seimas were attended by 95% of the electorate, a stamp certifying that the person has voted would be affixed in his passport, with 99.19% of them voting for the candidates of the Lithuanian Labour People's Union. According to the election law, candidates who received the majority of votes would be considered elected representatives. Half of the candidates polled less than half the votes, but the regime announced that all candidates were elected and the results were therefore fraudulent. A similar farce occurred in Estonia and Latvia. On July 22nd, the Lithuanian People's Seimas passed a declaration nationalizing all land, turning it into state property and making farmers land users. Banks and major industrial companies were also taken over by the state. The Seimas formed a delegation of 20 members, led by Paleckis, which went to Moscow on August 3rd, where they reportedly expressed Lithuania's desire to join the USSR. This formalized Lithuania's annexation, fulfilling the Soviets' imperial ambitions. Lithuania's institutions were soon staffed by experts brought in from the USSR who implemented the Soviet regime. Despite this, the internal border still existed between Lithuania and the rest of the Soviet Union. Agricultural reforms targeted farmers with more than 30 hectares, labeling them as kulaks, wealthy farmers and enemies of the people, and subjecting them to heavy taxation, tripling their tax burden. Landless or poor farmers could receive up to 10 hectares, while the remaining land went to the state, reserved for the establishment of the collective farms. Additionally, businesses with more than 20 employees were nationalized, leading to industries facing shortages of raw materials. Shortages of goods and long queues appeared. The introduction of the Soviet ruble alongside the Lithuanian litas in the fall of 1940 led to inflation. Personal savings lost value and citizens losing their bank deposits as financial institutions were nationalized. But the worst was about to come. In the night of the 13th to the 14th of June 1941, around 17,000 Latvians were arrested and deported by the Red Army. Many of them would never return. And then, on the 22nd of June that year, Nazi Germany invaded the USSR. Operation Barbarossa had commenced, and Army Group North swiftly moved to the Baltic nations towards Leningrad. Among its ranks were Baltic Germans who recently had left their country and were now assisting the Germans as they knew the language and the terrain. As the Germans marched into Lithuania, the June uprising occurred, in which 25,000 armed Lithuanians fought against the Soviets, occupying many strategic points. Suffering hundreds of casualties, cities like Kaunas and Vilnius came in Lithuanian hands before the Germans arrived. They proclaimed the Provisional Government of Lithuania. It was formed in secret before, now announced, and disbanded on German orders later, because the Germans did not care a bit about Lithuanian independence. Well, they were against it, and thus the Lithuanian institutions that had sprung up were disbanded on German orders. Lithuania was incorporated into the Reichskommissariat Ostland as the Generalbezirk Litauen. And so the Lithuanians changed occupier, although many Lithuanians were willing to work together with the Germans. The Lithuanians were probably the boldest in proposing collaboration. Colonel Oskaras Urbonas offered to organize an entire brigade to march in with the Wehrmacht, but the Germans wanted no such thing, preferring instead individual Lithuanians dispersed across Army Group North. If you're interested in Lithuanian collaboration with the Nazis, well, I made a video for you right here. And I also made a video about the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland. Click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.